In 1900, 9 in 10 Black Americans still lived in the rural South, and yet thousands of the best dishes their kitchens ever made never reached a single page. They lived in the hands of one woman, the one everybody called Big Mama, and she measured nothing by the cup. A pinch, a handful, a feel for when the grease was ready. When she passed, the handwritten recipe card on her cabinet door told you the name and little else. Number 17 on this list fed an entire church basement on Sunday and was never written down once. Number 11 came north during the Great Migration and quietly disappeared in a city apartment. Number 3 on this list was the funeral dish nobody could ever get right again. Here is the painful part. The meals that fed the most people are the ones we can recover the least. So gather round the stove and let us save a few, because here are 30 Big Mama recipes that vanished when the last grandmother passed. Number 30, cornbread and buttermilk. This was the supper she made when there was no supper, and nobody ever complained. She crumbled day-old cornbread into a tall glass, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and let it sit until the bread went soft and tangy. Some folks ate it with a spoon-like soup. Others tipped the glass back and drank it down on the porch after a long day in the heat. For families stretching one skillet across a week, this was both the last meal of the day and the start of the next. Then commercial dairy changed, palates changed, and a generation decided buttermilk belonged in a recipe, not in a glass. A dish that fed millions quietly slipped out the back door of the kitchen. Number 29, ash cake. Before there was an oven in the cabin, there was the hearth, and the hearth is where this cornbread was born. The cook mixed cornmeal, water, and salt into a stiff dough, then wrapped each cake in wet corn shucks or a cabbage leaf or the broad leaf of the tulip poplar. The little bundles went straight into the wood coals to bake. When she pulled them out and brushed away the ash, the bread inside was steamed, soft and smoky, sweet from the leaf that held it. Enslaved cooks made this in the fields, and free families carried it forward into the next century. It was African memory and Native American method braided into one humble loaf. But coals gave way to gas ranges, and nobody bakes in a fireplace anymore. The wrapped cake that survived slavery did not survive the modern stove. Number 28, squirrel stew. There is no soul food dish more honest about where it came from than this one. Hunting put meat on the table when the smokehouse was empty, and a couple of squirrels could feed a houseful with enough gravy and dumplings stretched around them. Archaeologists have found squirrel bones near old slave quarters, proof that this protein went back generations before anyone wrote it down. Big Mama browned the meat slow and let it simmer until the gravy turned the color of dark molasses. Served over rice or biscuits, it tasted like the woods in autumn. The Great Migration pulled families into city apartments with no hunting grounds within reach. A dish built on the land could not follow them onto the pavement. Number 27, souse, the hog's head cheese. When the family killed a hog in the cold of December, nothing was thrown away, and the head became its own delicacy. The cook simmered it for hours with onion, pepper, and a generous splash of vinegar until the meat fell from the bone. She picked it clean by hand, packed it into a bowl, and let the natural gelatin set it firm overnight in the cold pantry. Sliced thin on a cracker, souse was tangy and rich and stood proud on the holiday table beside the ham. It was the whole animal genius of people who could waste nothing and still eat well. Hog killing time faded as families bought their pork in plastic at the store. The pieces nobody else wanted became the dish nobody now knows how to make. Number 26, chow chow. Every garden gives more than a family can eat at once, and this bright relish was the answer to that abundance. Green tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, and onion went into the pot with vinegar, mustard seed, and a little sugar, then into jars to wait out the winter. A spoonful brightened a plate of pinto beans or sat beside the greens like a little burst of summer in February. Working mothers in the rural South put up dozens of jars in late September against the lean months. It was thrift you could taste, a way to carry July all the way to spring. Then supermarkets sold pickles year-round, and the canning kettle went up to the attic. A garden saved in glass became a craft almost nobody practices. Number 25, Benny wafers. Down in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, the Gullah Geechee people kept a seed alive that crossed the ocean with their ancestors. They called it Benny, the West African word for what most Americans know as sesame. Big Mama toasted the seeds until they turned nutty and gold, folded them into a thin brown sugar batter, and baked them into wafers so delicate they shattered at the first bite. The seed itself was thought to bring good luck. It was West Africa preserved in a cookie, a thread of home stitched into Carolina soil. As the islands developed and the old families scattered, the Ben patches disappeared with them. A seed that survived the Middle Passage now struggles to survive the supermarket. Number 24, sweet potato pone. Long before the smooth sweet potato pie took over the holiday table, there was its rougher, older cousin. Big Mama grated raw sweet potato by hand, mixed it with molasses, a little egg, and warm spices, then baked it slow until the edges caramelized and the middle stayed soft and almost pudding-like. The grated texture gave it a chew the pie never had, and the molasses made it taste of an older South. This was holiday food in cabins where a fancy pie crust was a luxury nobody could spare. As bakers chased the silky elegance of pie, the humble pone got pushed off the menu. The dessert that came first is the one most people have never heard of. Number 23, crackling bread. After the law was rendered down at hog killing time, the crispy bits of fried skin and fat were left behind, and Big Mama knew exactly what to do with them. She folded those golden cracklings straight into her cornbread batter, so every slice held little pockets of salty crunch. Baked in a hot skillet, the bread came out rich and savory and needed no butter at all. It was the reward for a hard, cold day of butchering, eaten warm at the kitchen table. Nothing from the hog was wasted, and this bread proved it tasted that way on purpose. When families stopped rendering their own lard, the cracklings vanished and the bread vanished with them. A reward built from scraps became a memory built from nothing. Number 22, the Sunday dinner that held the family together. This is not a single recipe so much as the heartbeat. The other recipes lived inside, and it deserves a moment of its own. Picture the kitchen on a Sunday morning across the rural South and the migration cities alike. The woman everyone called Big Mama had been up since before light, and by the time church let out, the whole house already smelled of it. There were the greens, cooking down low with a piece of smoked meat, the chicken frying in the heavy pan, the pots of rice and beans, the pan of cornbread cooling on the windowsill. She did not work from a card, she worked from her hands, from 40 years of knowing when the grease whispered that it was ready and when the greens had given up their bitterness. The grandchildren were sent to set the table and shell the peas, and in that sending, the recipes passed down without a word being written. Aunts argued over whether there was enough salt, and somebody always said it needed more. A neighbor who had no people of her own knew there was always a plate waiting, no matter how thin the week had been. This was the engine room of the family, the place where the week was repaired and the children were fed and the old folks were honored. The food was the language, but the table was the point. When she was gone, the chicken could be fried by somebody else and the greens could be cooked again. Yet the gravity that pulled everyone into one room on one afternoon was the thing that truly vanished. We can write down a recipe. We have never learned to write down a Sunday like that. The dish that disappeared was never really a dish at all. Number 21, roast possum with sweet potatoes. A century ago, this was a delicacy that Black epicures held in genuine high regard, hard as that is to imagine today. The animal was cleaned and parboiled to render the heavy fat, then roasted in a pan ringed with sweet potatoes that drank up the drippings. As they baked, the meat came out tender and dark, the potatoes glazed and soft, and the whole thing arrived at the table as a point of pride, not a punchline. It was a celebration dish that marked a special Sunday or a homecoming. Families carried the recipe north during the Great Migration, but the city had no woods and no possums to hunt. Tastes shifted, shame crept in, and a proud dish became an embarrassed silence. What was once company food is now a recipe almost nobody will admit their grandmother made. Number 20, Hoppin' John. Eaten on New Year's Day, this humble pot of black-eyed peas and rice was supposed to carry luck into the coming year. Big Mama cooked the peas down with a ham hock or a piece of salt pork, then folded in rice so the grains soaked up every bit of the smoky liquor. A pot of greens went beside it for folding money, and the peas stood in for coins, a whole prosperity wish served on one plate. The version most people know now comes from a box, oversalted and rushed. The true one took half a day and tasted like it. As the New Year ritual faded into a quick microwave nod, the real Hoppin' John slipped away. A bowl of hope cooked low and slow became a side dish nobody waits for. Number 19, tea cakes. Somewhere between a cookie and a cake, these tender little rounds go all the way back to the 1600s, when enslaved bakers made their own answer to the fancy European confections. Big Mama creamed butter and sugar, worked in just enough flour, and dropped them by hand onto the pan, where they baked up soft and barely sweet. They paired with a cup of coffee on the porch, or they went into a child's hand to keep them quiet during the long service. Every family had its own version, and no two grandmothers measured the same. The store-bought cookie aisle made the home tea cake feel like too much trouble for too little show. So the recipe that comforted 3 centuries of children faded into a faint family memory. Number 18, apple stack cake. This towering dessert was a community in cake form, and that is exactly why it disappeared. Each thin molasses and ginger layer was baked separately, then stacked with spice-dried apple filling until the cake stood tall and proud. At a country gathering, families would each bring a layer to donate, and the number of layers a couple received was said to measure how well loved they were. It needed days because the apples had to soften the dry cake into something sliceable. Nobody made this alone, and nobody made it fast. A cake that measured a family's friendships became too much work for one pair of hands. Number 17, fried catfish and spaghetti. Here's the one that fed an entire church basement on a Sunday and was never written down even once. Down south, the fish fry and the spaghetti pot came together into a plate that confuses outsiders and comforts everybody raised on it. Big Mama dredged the catfish in seasoned cornmeal and fried it crisp, then ladled a long simmered tomato gravy over a mound of spaghetti beside it. The whole thing was built to multiply, to stretch from a family of 6 to a hall of 60 when the deacons announced the supper. And that handwritten card on the cabinet door said only fish and spaghetti, no amounts and no times, because the rest lived in her hands and her ear. A dish that fed the most people left behind the fewest instructions. Number 16, rabbit okra soup. Trace this soup backward and it draws a straight line from the country to the city and shows you exactly where a dish goes to die. A rabbit caught in the morning went into the pot with okra, tomatoes, corn, and whatever the garden gave, simmered until the okra thickened it into a stew you could stand a spoon in. It was rural self-sufficiency in a bowl, a meal that asked only a snare and a patch of dirt. The okra tied it to West Africa, and the rabbit tied it to the land. City life took away the snare, the garden, and the afternoon all at once. A soup that needed the countryside could not be made on a fire escape. Number 15, smothered chicken and gravy. Long before fried chicken became the face of soul food, the smothered version did the quiet heavy lifting on a weeknight. Big Mama browned the pieces in the heavy pan, drowned them in a slow onion gravy, and set the lid on tight so the steam did the rest. An hour later, the meat slid off the bone and the gravy had thickened into something you wanted to sop with every crumb of bread. The dish asked for patience, not money, which is why it carried a family through the lean middle of the week. Then the deep fryer made chicken fast and patience went out of fashion. A bird cooked slow under a lid lost out to a bird cooked loud in oil. Number 14, egg custard pie. Some desserts shout, and this one only ever whispered, which is part of why it slipped away. Big Mama beat together eggs, sugar, and milk, dusted the top with nutmeg, and baked it just until the center barely held its shape. There was no fruit to hide behind and no chocolate to lean on, only the plain, honest taste of the few things a poor pantry always had. It was the pie you could make on a Tuesday when there was nothing fancy in the house, the pie that stretched a half dozen eggs into Sunday comfort. Country churches knew it well because it traveled in a tin and never spoiled the way cream pies did in the heat. But supermarket bakeries chased flash and color, and a pale brown custard looked like nothing on a shelf. The simplest pie in the South became the one nobody bothers to bake. Number 13, watermelon rind preserves. After the family ate the sweet red heart of the melon in July, Big Mama refused to throw out the thick pale rind because nothing edible left her kitchen without a fight. She peeled away the green skin, cut the rind into small cubes, and simmered them for hours in sugar syrup with lemon and a whisper of clove until they turned clear and jewel-like. Spooned onto a biscuit in the dead of winter, those translucent bites tasted like a summer afternoon you thought was long gone. It was the finest example of a whole way of cooking, the belief that the part everybody else discarded was the part worth saving. As cheap jelly filled the grocery shelves, that faith faded. The candy made from a garbage scrap became a forgotten craft. Number 12, liver pudding. Out of the Carolina Piedmont came a dish built from the parts of the hog that polite cooks pretended did not exist. The cooks simmered liver and scrap meat with onion, black pepper, and sage, ground it soft, and bound it with cornmeal until it set into a savory loaf. Sliced and fried for breakfast or spread thick on a morning biscuit, it carried a deep peppery richness no store meat has matched. It was the genius of a people who turned what the smokehouse rejected into something worth waking up for. Hog killing time made it possible, and the cold pantry kept it safe. When families stopped butchering their own pork, the liver pudding had no source and no reason. A breakfast born of thrift quietly left the table. Number 11, salmon croquettes. This is the dish that came north during the Great Migration and quietly disappeared in a city apartment, and its whole story lives in a humble can. When New Deal subsidies dropped canned salmon to a few pennies a tin, Black families packing up for Chicago and Detroit and Harlem carried the recipe with them like a piece of home. Big Mama flaked the fish into a bowl, bound it with egg, cornmeal, and a little onion, then patted out cakes and fried them golden for a Saturday breakfast. It let a family eat something that tasted of the southern fish fry without a river anywhere in sight. For a while, it was the smell that said the family had made it through another week. Then frozen dinners took over the city morning. A dish that crossed half a country to follow its people went silent in the rooms it landed in. Number 10, red rice. Along the Carolina and Georgia coast, the Gullah Geechee people kept a rice dish that carried West Africa in every grain. Big Mama cooked the rice down low in a tomato base, seasoned with onion, pepper, and a piece of smoked meat, stirring just enough that each grain stayed separate and stained a deep, rusty red. It was Sunday food and gathering food, the pot that sat in the middle of the table while everything else circled around it. The dish was a living memory of the jollof rice their ancestors made an ocean away, carried across the Middle Passage in the hands that survived it, as the old rice culture of the islands gave way to resorts and golf courses. The families scattered and the recipe thinned out. A red pot that held an entire heritage now cooks in fewer and fewer kitchens. Number 9, neck bones and lima, beans. The neck was the cheapest cut at the meat counter, little more than bone and the sweet scraps clinging to it, and Big Mama knew it was a treasure. She simmered the neck bones for hours until the meat surrendered, then dropped in lima beans to drink up all that smoky, marrow-rich liquor. What came out was a thick, sticking-to-your-ribs supper that cost almost nothing and fed everybody twice. It was poverty turned into plenty by patience alone. As cooks reached for boneless and quick, the humble neck got left in the cooler. A pot built on the cheapest bone in the shop became a dish folks forgot how to love. Number 8, smothered pork chops. A thin, tough chop was no problem at all to a woman who understood that gravy forgives everything. Big Mama dredged the chops in seasoned flour, seared them hard in the pan, then built an onion gravy right in the drippings and laid the meat back down to bathe in it. Covered and left to simmer low, the toughest cut went tender and the gravy turned the color of a roasted pecan. Served over rice, it stretched a single cheap chop into a plate that satisfied a grown man after a long shift. The dish was about coaxing richness out of meagerness, never about expensive meat. As thick boneless chops and quick skillet meals took over, the slow smothering grew rare. A technique that rescued the cheapest cut became a Sunday memory most kitchens stopped keeping. Number 7, chitterlings. No dish on this list carries the weight of history the way this one does, and none asks more of the cook. The hog intestines were among the few parts handed down to the enslaved, and the women who received them refused to be defeated by the gift. Cleaning them was a day-long labor of rinsing and stripping, and only after that came the long simmer with onion, pepper, and vinegar. The reward was a rich, tender, deeply seasoned plate that turned the lowest scrap into a holiday delicacy. For generations, it was the proudest dish at the Christmas table, the taste of triumph over scarcity itself. But few young cooks will spend a whole day cleaning what the store sells, pre-bagged and bland. A dish that fed survival through the worst of times is fading from the very tables it built. Number 6, okra and tomatoes. The seed itself sailed across the ocean in the hands of the enslaved, hidden and guarded, because okra was West Africa refusing to be left behind. Big Mama stewed the green pods down with summer tomatoes, onion, and a little bacon grease until they melded into a soft, soupy side that thickened on its own. It was the garden at the peak of August, captured in one pot. The dish was a direct line to the pepper pots and stews of the African coast, a memory cooked fresh every summer. As frozen vegetables flattened the seasons, the slow summer stew lost its moment. A pot of pure heritage became just another vegetable nobody waits all year to make. Number 5, buttermilk pie. When the orchard was bare and the berry patch was brown, Big Mama could still set a pie on the table, and the secret was the jug of buttermilk in the cold pantry. She whisked it with eggs, sugar, a spoon of flour, and a little vanilla, poured it into a crust, and baked it until the top turned freckled gold over a soft, tangy custard. It needed no fruit and no fortune, only the plain staples a Southern kitchen never ran out of. This was the dessert of the lean winter and the lean year, proof that comfort did not require a single luxury. As the freezer aisle made strawberries a January thing, the no-fruit pie lost its purpose. A sweet built for the season of nothing slipped out of the recipe box. Number 4, pickled pig's feet. The feet were what nobody at the big house wanted, and so they became one more thing the enslaved cook had to make worth eating. Big Mama simmered them tender, then packed them in a crock with vinegar, hot peppers, and pickling spice to cure in the cold until the meat went firm and tangy. Pulled out and eaten cold, they had a bright sour bite and a gelatin richness that made them a corner store staple for a century. It was a small act of defiance, taking a discarded scrap and turning it into a treat folks paid good money for. As taste turned squeamish and the old whole hog thrift faded, the jar quietly emptied. A delicacy made from the lowliest part of the animal became something most people can no longer stomach. Number 3, macaroni pie. Here's the funeral dish nobody could ever get right again, and that hurts more than any other loss on this list. Long before the box and the powder, the real version was a layered baked pie, the recipe carried into this country by James Hemings, the enslaved chef who trained in the kitchens of Paris. Big Mama layered cooked macaroni with sharp cheese and a custard of egg and milk, baked until the top blistered brown and the inside set firm enough to slice. When a loved one passed, this was the dish that crowded the repast table, the one the whole community judged the cook by. And every grandmother had her own ratio of egg to cheese to milk that lived only in her hands. So when she was gone, the exact taste went with her. Folks have spent funerals ever since chasing a flavor they never quite catch. Number 2, hush puppies. Born at the riverbank in the fish fry, these little fried cornmeal nuggets came with a story as old as the skillet they cooked beside. The cook mixed cornmeal, onion, and a little buttermilk into a thick batter, then dropped spoonfuls into the same hot grease where the catfish had just fried. They came out crisp and golden outside, soft and sweet within, soaking up every bit of flavor left in the pan. The old tale says cooks tossed the fried scraps to the barking dogs to hush them, and the name stuck for good. It was the perfect thrift, a free side built from the friar's leftovers. As the home fish fry gave way to frozen baskets, the hand-dropped puppy faded, a side made from nothing but a hot pan and a quick wrist nearly disappeared. Number 1, collard greens with Potlikker. The single most important thing on this whole list was never the greens at all. It was the dark, smoky broth left in the bottom of the pot, the liquid the plantation owners poured out and the enslaved cooks were left to keep. They learned that this Potlikker held the iron and the vitamins the leaves gave up, so they sopped it with cornbread and grew strong on what others called waste. Big Mama cooked her collards down low all afternoon with a smoked ham bone, and the broth beneath them was the true prize. To pour out the Potlikker was a sin in her kitchen, a throwing away of the thing that had kept her people alive. Today, folks drain the greens and dump the liquor down the sink without a thought. The most precious thing Big Mama ever cooked is the thing we now wash away. Number 21, salting the meat the night before you cook. It, a Birmingham kitchen in 1955. Big Mama unwrapped a pork shoulder from the butcher paper and rubbed kosher salt deep into the fat cap with both hands. She covered it loose with a dish towel and slid it onto the cool side of the icebox. By morning, the salt had drawn the moisture to the surface, then pulled it back in along with every grain of seasoning. The meat cooked tender enough to fall off the bone with the back of a fork. Restaurant chefs would later call this a dry brine and write whole books about it. Big Mama called it leaving the meat alone overnight. She had learned the same trick from her own grandmother, who had learned it on a tobacco farm in 1898. The salt did the same work in every kitchen. The patience was the seasoning. Number 18, hand test in the hot pan with a flick of water. Big Mama did not set the burner and walk away. She tested the pan with her fingers and a drop of water. She would dip the tips of her fingers in the cold water glass next to the stove, shake them once over the dry iron, and watch what the droplets did. If the water vanished with a quiet hiss, the pan was still too cold and the cornbread batter would soak in and stick. If the water beaded up and skittered across the surface like little silver balls before evaporating, the pan was at the right temperature for searing, somewhere over 400 degrees. The drops danced because of what physicists later named the Leidenfrost effect, where the water forms a thin protective layer of steam that lets the bead float on its own vapor cushion. Big Mama had no name for it. She just knew that when the water danced, the pan was ready, and the first piece of meat would hit the iron with the right kind of sizzle. Wrong sizzle meant wrong supper. Number 16, scrambling eggs in a cold pan over the lowest possible flame. A Sunday breakfast in 1959 Detroit, the radio playing Mahalia Jackson. Big Mama cracked 4 eggs into a cold cast iron skillet, dropped a tablespoon of butter into the center, and turned the burner to its lowest setting. She stirred the eggs slow with a wooden spoon, never lifting the pan, never raising the heat. 8 minutes later, the eggs came out the color of fresh cream, soft as custard, the curds barely formed. She salted them at the end. She served them on a slice of buttered toast with a side of fried apples. Here's the thing, a French chef in Manhattan would later teach his cooks the same exact technique and charge $34 for the plate. Big Mama charged a kiss on the cheek and a thank you, ma'am. The eggs were better than anything in any restaurant for one simple reason. She cooked them like she meant it. Number 20, stretching tough cuts of meat with buttermilk overnight. When the round steak was the cheap kind, the kind that could turn into shoe leather under the wrong hand, Big Mama reached for the buttermilk crock. She would lay the meat flat in a deep bowl, pour cold buttermilk over the top until the steak was fully covered, and slide the bowl into the icebox before she went to bed. The next morning, the same cut that would have fought a fork the night before was relaxed and pliable, ready to be breaded and pan-fried into chicken fried steak that you could cut with the edge of a butter knife. The trick is lactic acid. The mild acid in cultured buttermilk slowly breaks down tough muscle fibers without ever turning the surface mushy the way stronger acids will. Vinegar moves too fast, wine moves too sharp. Buttermilk moves the speed of grandmother time, slow and patient and gentle, which was exactly the right speed for cheap meat and a house full of mouths to feed by morning. Nothing else worked as well, and she always had a quart of buttermilk on hand for biscuits anyway. Number 18, finishing the gravy with a tablespoon of cold butter swirled in off the heat. A Thanksgiving morning in 1957, Charlotte, the roasting pan held 2 cups of dark drippings and a slurry of flour and water whisked smooth. Big Mama brought it to a simmer, scraped every brown bit off the bottom, and turned the burner off. Then she dropped a cold pat of butter half the size of a matchbox, into the center of the gravy and swirled the pan in a slow circle. The butter melted as it moved. The fat coated the starch molecules. The gravy turned glossy and thick, the kind of finish a French chef would call mounted with butter and charge you $80 for at a hotel. Big Mama called it the last shine. She did the same thing to the potlikker, the red-eye gravy, and the pan sauce. The trick cost 3 cents and made every plate look like the cover of a magazine. Number 15, crisping a meat top with bread heat in a covered pan. Without a working broiler, Big Mama still got a golden crust on every chop and chicken thigh that left her stove. The move was simple and almost forgotten now. After the meat had cooked through in the heavy pan, she would lay a few thick slices of day-old bread directly on top of the meat, clamp the lid down tight, and turn the burner up high for 1 full minute. The dry bread soaked up the rising steam. The trapped heat had nowhere to escape but back down into the meat, and the top of the chop browned and crisped as if it had been under a broiler. She would lift the lid, peel the bread off, and serve the meat with the crisp bread crumble over the top like a free seasoning. Nothing wasted, nothing extra bought, just heat used twice. Number 24, knocking the cast iron skillet to test the heat before the lard ever went in. A Kentucky kitchen in 1958. The pan had been her mother's, then her aunt's, then hers. Big Mama would drum the iron rim with the back of her wooden spoon and listen for the change in pitch, a low, ringing tone that said the pan was ready. Cold iron answered dull. Hot iron answered like a bell. Once the bell rang, she dropped a pinch of cornmeal into the dry pan. If the meal danced and browned in 3 seconds, the chicken went in. If it didn't, she waited a beat longer. There wasn't a thermometer, an infrared gun, or an app. There was a woman, an iron pan, and 40 years of knowing. The fried chicken came out crackling. The skin shattered. The meat was juicy enough to drip down the wrist of the child who ate it, standing at the counter. Year after year, that same pan rang the same bell. Number 23, rendering pork fat on a Sunday and pouring it into a coffee can for the rest of the week. A wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, 1953. Your Big Mama cut 3 pounds of fat back into 1/2-inch cubes, dropped them into a heavy pot with a 1/4 cup of water, and let the whole thing simmer over a low flame for 2 hours. The water cooked off, the fat melted out clear as honey. The crackling sank to the bottom, golden and crisp, ready to be salted and snacked on by any grandchild who wandered through. The clear lard went through a square of cheesecloth into a Maxwell house can on the back of the stove. That can fed her family every supper for a week, and the next and the next. The thing is, modern science didn't walk back its warnings on lard until around 2010. By then, she'd been cooking with it for 60 years and had never seen the inside of a cardiologist's office. Number 22, seasoning the heavy iron pan with bacon fat. The heavy black pan on the back of Big Mama's stove was older than her grown children, and it shone like wet stone every morning. After every meal, she rinsed it clean with hot water, never soap, dried it on a hot burner so no bead of moisture could sit on the metal, and rubbed a thin film of bacon fat across the cooking surface with a folded square of paper bag. That single thin coat, baked into the iron by the residual heat, was what kept the pan from rusting and kept the next batch of cornbread from sticking. By the end of a decade, the surface was as slick as glass. By the end of 3 decades, the pan was an heirloom. The science behind it is simple. Animal fat polymerizes under heat into a slick, durable layer that bonds to the iron at the molecular level. Big Mama did not need the word polymerize. She knew that bacon fat made the pan behave, and that lard worked too in a pinch, and that vegetable oil never quite gave you the same finish. More than that, she knew the pan itself was an inheritance. The skillet she used had been her mother's and her mother's mother's before that. Every meal cooked in it left a faint trace of itself in the seasoning. So the cornbread you ate on a Tuesday in 1972 carried something of every Sunday dinner that came before. The iron held the memory the same way the family held the recipes, and she handed both down to whichever daughter showed up most often in the kitchen. By federal census data, more than 70% of Black Southern households in 1950 owned at least one heavy iron pan, and most of those pans are still cooking today. That is a survival rate no non-stick pan will ever match. Number 19, the cornmeal dredge, done twice with a 5-minute rest between coats. A Tuesday supper in 1961 Atlanta, the kitchen window opened to a thunderstorm rolling off Stone Mountain. Big Mama had 3 plates set out on the counter. The first held buttermilk, thick and tangy, a splash of hot sauce stirred in. The second held seasoned flour, salt, pepper, garlic powder, and a heavy pinch of paprika. The third held white cornmeal mixed with the same seasonings. She dipped each piece of catfish into the buttermilk, then rolled it through the flour, then back into the buttermilk a second time, then into the cornmeal. She set every dredged fillet on a wire rack over a plate and walked away for exactly 5 minutes. The first coat hydrated, the second coat dried into the first. By the time the lard hit 365 degrees in the iron skillet, the crust was already half locked on. She fried each fillet 2 minutes aside. The crust came out shattering crisp, golden as a Carolina sunset, sealed so tight that not a drop of oil reached the white flesh underneath. She learned the trick from a fish fry on the Pearl River when she was 11 years old. The man running the fryer was an oysterman from Biloxi who'd been frying mullet for 40 years. He told her the rest is the recipe. The buttermilk and the meal are just paint. The rest is what holds the picture together. The part few people talk about is that Big Mama passed it on to her 3 daughters and 7 granddaughters, one by one, every Friday night. One of them is still doing it in a kitchen in Charlotte, and her grandchildren can't eat fast food fish without saying it tastes like soggy cardboard. The trick is older than the supermarket. It's older than the deep fryer. It's as old as a Black grandmother who refused to serve her family anything less than glass. Number 17, saving the potlikker for the next day's soup. The dark broth left in the bottom of the greens pot was never thrown out in Big Mama's kitchen. It was the foundation of tomorrow's supper. She would ladle the potlikker into a clean glass jar, screw the lid down tight, and set it on the cold shelf of the icebox. The next afternoon, that same jar became the cooking liquid for a pot of rice, or the simmering base for a quick pan of dumplings, or the soup itself if the cornbread held out. The liquid carried every bit of flavor that had cooked out of the greens and the smoked meat, along with most of the water-soluble vitamins, which is why potlikker was prescribed by Southern doctors during the Depression for anemic children. Big Mama saved it because the alternative was pouring grocery money down the drain, and she had never poured grocery money anywhere but into the pot. 1 pound of greens fed the family twice, and the second meal was usually the better one because the flavor had a night to settle and deepen. Number 22, soaking dried beans overnight with a teaspoon of baking soda in the water. A Memphis kitchen in 1962. Big Mama dropped a pound of dried pintos into a chipped enamel bowl, covered them with cold water, and stirred in a single teaspoon of soda from the orange box on the shelf. The beans drank the water, the skins softened. The soda neutralized the gas compounds that had ruined a Sunday afternoon. By morning, the beans had doubled in size. She drained them, rinsed them once, and simmered them with a smoked ham hock and 1 chopped onion. The pot took 90 minutes instead of 4 hours. She saved gas, she saved time, she saved your granddaddy the embarrassment of a long car ride home from church. The trick traveled with her family from Tennessee to Detroit during the Great Migration, and her granddaughter was still doing it in a Cleveland apartment in 1991. Number 23, testing hot oil with the wooden spoon handle. Before a single piece of chicken hit the grease, Big Mama lowered the dry end of a wooden spoon straight down into the pot. If the wood sat there quiet, the oil was cold and the chicken would sit in it like a sponge. If a slow string of pearl bubbles climbed the handle, the oil was right around 350 degrees, the temperature every fried chicken recipe in the world will tell you to chase. If the bubbles came up fast and angry, she slid the pot off the eye and waited. No clip-on thermometer ever lived in her kitchen. The wood told the truth every time because moisture trapped in the grain reacted to the heat of the oil with predictable bubbling. And once you had seen it, you never forgot what right looked like. Her chicken came out the color of polished walnut and the crust never went soggy on the plate. Number 20, dropping a clean copper penny into the greens pot to keep the color bright. A Sunday afternoon in Macon, Georgia, 1948. The collards had been picked from the garden that morning, the stems stripped, the leaves stacked and rolled and sliced into ribbons. Big Mama dropped them into the pot with a smoked turkey neck, a splash of cider vinegar, and a single Lincoln penny scrubbed bright with a slice of lemon. The greens cooked 2.5 hours. The copper held the green pigment in the leaves, so the pot came out emerald instead of army drab. She fished the penny out with a slotted spoon before serving and dropped it back into the cleaning jar by the sink. Modern cookbooks tell you to skip this trick because they're worried about leaching. Your Big Mama would tell you a clean penny and a clean pot for 2 hours never killed a soul, and the greens still tasted like Sunday. Number 21, tenderizing tough greens with a splash of vinegar. The collards that came up out of the fall garden after the first frost were sweeter, but the leaves were leathery enough to resemble a shoe. Big Mama dealt with them by tipping a small splash of apple cider vinegar into the simmering pot about an hour in, and then she let the greens go for another 60 to 90 minutes without lifting the lid more than twice. The mild acid in the vinegar breaks down the tough cellulose in mature greens, which is why the leaves end up silky instead of stringy. It also cuts the natural bitterness that lives in the stems. She never measured the splash. She knew the right amount by the smell that rose off the pot, somewhere between sharp and sweet, and she trusted the pot to tell her when the greens had given in. The Potlikker at the bottom was the prize, dark and savory, ready to be sopped up with a square of warm cornbread. Number 17, smothering meat in its own, steam under a heavy lid for 90 minutes. A Saturday afternoon in 1952, New Orleans, the rain coming sideways off Lake Pontchartrain. Big Mama browned 6 pork chops in bacon grease, lifted them out, and dropped 2 sliced onions into the same pan. The onions melted. She poured in 2 cups of water, set the chops back in the pan, and clamped the lid down tight. The fire went to a whisper. The meat cooked in its own steam for 90 minutes. The onions broke down into a mahogany gravy. The chops came out tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Edna Lewis wrote about smothering as the heart of country cooking. The technique wasn't a recipe. It was a relationship between heat, water, and patience. Modern cooks rush the same dish in a slow cooker and wonder why the meat tastes flat. Big Mama could have told them, the lid is the secret. The time is the seasoning. The patience is the love. Number 16, rescuing scorched milk with cold tap water and a clean pan. A pot of milk that turned its back on you for 30 seconds could fill the whole house with a burnt smell that lingered for days. Big Mama did not throw it out. She lifted the scorched pot off the heat, set it straight into a sink of cold tap water without stirring, and waited 2 full minutes. The cold shock kept the burnt layer welded to the bottom of the pot instead of mixing up into the rest of the milk. Then she gently poured the still good milk off the top into a fresh, clean pan and finished cooking it without a hint of scorch. The trick saved gravy, it saved oatmeal, it saved more pots of grits than any son or daughter cared to count, and the burnt pot soaked overnight in baking soda water came clean by morning. Number 15, brining the chicken in salted water with a bay leaf for 4 hours before frying. A Friday afternoon in 1963 Jackson, Mississippi. Big Mama mixed a 1/4 cup of kosher salt into a 1/2 gallon of cold water, dropped 2 bay leaves into the brine, and submerged a cut-up chicken in the bowl. She covered it and left it on the cool tile floor of the pantry for 4 hours. The salt traveled into every fiber of meat. The water locked itself in. By the time she dredged the chicken through her seasoned flour, the meat was already 1/3 of the way to perfect. She fried it in lard at 350 degrees for 14 minutes. The skin came out the color of a Carolina pine cone. The white meat was juicy enough to leave a slick on the plate. Her grandchildren would tell you nobody since has ever made fried chicken that good. Number 24, measuring salt in the cup of the palm. There were no spoons in her hand when the salt box came down off the shelf. Big Mama poured the salt into the soft hollow of her left palm, the one nearest the thumb, and gave it a half shake to settle the grains. A flat puddle was for greens. A small mound was for the bean pot. A heap that crowned over the edge of her hand was for a fresh batch of cornbread batter. She had learned the measure standing next to her own grandmother as a child, and her hand knew the right weight the way a piano player's fingers know a chord. Food scientists today have measured the average cooking palm at right around 3/4 of a teaspoon. Big Mama had figured that out without ever opening a book. She salted by feel because feel never lied to her, and the cardboard box of Morton sat right there on the counter where her hand could find it in the dark. These are not just recipes, they are proof that a people who were given the scraps still found a way to set a full table. So before you scroll on, pick one of these 30 and promise yourself you will make it this week, not from a box and not in a hurry, but slow the way she would have. Then tell us in the comments which one you will make, because somebody reading this still has a grandmother who knew it, and somebody else lost theirs before they ever wrote it down. We want to hear the name your family called it. In the end, these were never only about food. They were about dignity, cooked low and served warm, and they belong to all of us now.